Hello, my name's Danny Braverman. I'm making this video from London, England. Some responses to some questions I've been sent, voices from the field of disability arts towards setting a new agenda. So I'll crack on. The first question is, what's my personal interest and professional background in the area of disability arts, and what would I like to achieve in this area of my work? I think my first introduction to disability theatre was when I was associate director. I'm a theatre director and a writer at Theatre Centre, which at the time in the late 80s, early 90s was the UK's, I suppose, best funded and leading touring young people's theatre company, touring mainly to schools. At that time we realised that there was a very uneven provision being given. Disabled young people weren't getting a fair crack of the whip because many were segregated into special schools. So I wrote Theatre Centre's first disability policy, and we started then working with disabled artists, particularly disabled performers, and looking at inclusive ways of working. Since that time, it's been an abiding interest. Most recently, in the last 4 years up until Christmas, I was the Chief Executive of the Orpheus Centre. The Orpheus Centre is a provision for young disabled adults 18 plus who are in transition to independent living, and we use performing arts, particularly music and theatre and dance, as a tool really to support these young adults in gaining confidence so that they could live more independently. I gave that up at Christmas, wanted to go back to more artistic practice and get away from management and fundraising, which was taking up a lot of my time. Now I have a particular interest in the role of drama in working with autistic young people. I am interested in challenging the notion that autistic people have a lack of empathy, and I think if you work with drama with a lot of autistic people, you see a great propensity to be able to imagine being somebody else, which is, if you like, the foundation of theatre and drama. And I'm also interested in the work from a human rights point of view, in looking at how theatre can be a vehicle for a more inclusive society. What does the development of disability arts look like, in your opinion, and how do we raise awareness of disability arts? We are in quite an extraordinary place in the UK at the moment. We're preparing for the opening ceremony of the Paralympics. We'll have the largest gathering of disabled people in London that the world has probably ever seen, and the largest cultural expression and public and visible cultural expression by disabled people that the world has ever seen. And over the last 10, 15, 20 years, a generation of innovative and brilliant disabled artists has emerged. So we are reaching a kind of a height of the work in the UK, which will have, I guess, its most public expression in the Cultural Olympiad. So I think we've moved an incredible way in 20 years in terms of the visibility of disabled people as artists. My concern in the UK is that this will fall away after 2012. We are in an age of austerity. We have a government that doesn't believe in the kind of investment in the arts that its predecessors did. Even, you know, it's cutting the arts, and in this age of austerity, whereas actually the amount of money invested is changed down the back of the sofa. And we are also looking at cuts in our government support and entitlement of disabled people to some very basic provision, and which actually does affect disabled people's ability to do anything, including being artists. So, for example, being able to afford assistance, to have buildings adapted, to have communication support, Many disabled people are in poverty in the UK, and that is only going to get worse. So how do we raise awareness of disability arts? Well, we work internationally, and this conversation is part of that. And we are going to use the Cultural Olympiad in 2012 and the Paralympics to profile the benefits not just to disabled people but to our wider community, and the benefits of inclusion, and not just for disabled people but for non-disabled people as well. The financial implications in relation to the development of work around disability arts, and what impact could financial support have on your ambitions? Well, I think I've just touched on that. We do have to look not just at arts funding but at our benefit system in the UK. At the moment there's quite a cruel push to move disabled people to reduce disabled people's benefits if they're not deemed fit for work by tests that are taken out by private contractors that are not fit for purpose. So there are people who are terminally ill with cancer who are being deemed fit for work in the UK, clearly cannot do any work, and it just demonstrates the difficulty that disabled people across the board are having just participating in the community, and the plans that our government have will make this a lot worse. We don't have a tradition or a culture or a tax regime that supports philanthropy in a meaning way. So we really need to just make an incredibly strong case in order to get the financial support that we need for the work to continue. I think the key to that is to point out that the UK does this work exceptionally well, and we are world leaders in many ways. Maybe that's something we can talk about between us, but certainly the work that the profile of disabled artists with companies like Grey Eye particularly, who are our country's leading disabled-led theatre company, but also the work that happens in young people's theatre with young people with quite profound and multiple impairments, sensory and learning impairments, the kinds of children and audiences that many people throughout the world wouldn't even consider as audiences because their level of cognition and ability to respond seems very limited. But through the work of people like Oily Cart and Bamboozle, theatre companies for young people in the UK, we've demonstrated that most exceptional work can happen for those audiences. We need to profile that, and we need people around the world to recognise we're world leaders, and I think if we're influencing those abroad who are saying, yes, please bring the work from the UK to us, then it will help us survive in the UK. What's your artistic approach to making work, either for, by or about disabled people? How do you make decisions about form and content? I won't go into this in huge depth. Seeing access, disability access, not as a bolt-on, not as a pain, not as a problem or a nuisance, but actually as a stimulus to the aesthetic. So, for example, integrating sign language into performance, audio description into performance, looking at how we make narratives understandable to people with learning disabilities, can actually lead to a very rich, multi-sensory, innovative kind of theatre that actually works for everybody. That's one element of the approach, and the other is a visibility of disabled people. Telling stories that are about disabled people's journeys, things that are hidden. I have a very strong belief that a lot of depictions of disabled people in art have been negative, and we know, don't we, from very often the only disabled character in a story, and particularly stories for children or stories children will watch, is the baddie, whether it be Captain Hook or Richard III or the Bond villains and so on. Or Tragic and Brave, as in the kind of Helen Keller stories. So I kind of, true story obviously, I am interested in starting with the truth of disabled people's experiences, but also looking at narratives that are rich if reinterpreted by disabled artists. So for example, what happens if you retell Hansel and Gretel, and Hansel is autistic and being lost in the woods has an extra resonance and an extra meaning. What is a perception of disability arts within the theatre community in your country? Is work valued and recognised? More so than ever, there is still a struggle for what we would call the mainstream in the UK to sit up and take notice. I would point to Jenny Seeley's work with Grey Eye. Jenny is now the director of Deaf Woman, who is the director of the opening ceremony of the Paralympics, so that's kind of a major gig for disabled artists. To my knowledge, no one from our National Theatre has ever seen any of her five-star productions in theatres that are a heartbeat away from their building. So they're not waking up and taking notice in terms of the big institutions, but the producing theatres, for example, the Theatre Royal Stratford East, which has a wonderful tradition in this country, was Joan Littlewood's theatre, as many people who are listening to this will know, has been co-producing with Grey Eye, and we are starting to see disabled artists on our main stages as opposed to on our fringe, and so that there is some movement there. Do you think we will see an improvement in the education of artists in the subject of disability arts? How should this happen? In some respects it is happening and growing. There's a field of work that's happening in our universities called applied theatre. That's what I used to call community theatre in this country, but applied theatre, but it does tend to have a kind of charitable model, and it's about using theatre and drama, if not precisely for therapeutic purposes, for social purposes. So the objective is, if you like, instrumental rather than intrinsic. The objective is to improve communication, to improve community cohesion, and so forth. A lot of I would say the vast majority of students taking those courses are non-disabled, and I have some questions about whether that's a very inclusive model. It's very, very, very hard for disabled artists to get proper training and proper recognition, and that's something we need to attend to. And as our government is retrogressive in terms of disability rights, and rights generally, the word entitlement has become a dirty word in the UK. So is another word for rights, isn't it? So we will find, I think, fewer and fewer disabled students. Although there has been the smallest bit of recognition, for example, in our drama schools, the old-fashioned ways of operating, which were about 5 years ago, for example, deaf people not getting into drama school because they wouldn't reach the singing requirement, mobility impaired people not reaching them, the movement requirement and all that kind of thing. That seems to be breaking down a little bit, very slowly. Again, we start with recognising the great work that's happening by disabled artists now, and just making a case and shouting about it, I think. What artistic training is available currently for artists with disabilities? Yes, bits and pieces, work within the companies. So Grey Eye will do a lot, as will all kinds of other companies, will sort of professional theatre companies and dance companies. Inclusive dance is very strong in the UK. Companies such as Canduco and Stopgap Dance and Magpie Dance and so on. There's a strong tradition of it, but in terms of the professional structures, in terms of the degree courses, in terms of the drama schools and the dance schools, it's still very, very marginal, and no one is really pressurising those people to give full professional training. So disabled artists, tend to get trained on the job and in small courses that are set up by those people who care about it. Should there be policies which support the inclusion of artists with disabilities within the professional arts? How do we ensure we have an inclusive arts sector? Well, yes, I think there should be. If you receive public money, you should be working for the whole cross-section of the community, and we do have, public. Actually, even if you're using private money, there should be, anti-discrimination legislation as there is in any kind of employment, and we as a society have an obligation and a duty to pay to remove the barriers that stop disabled people participating fully. We do have discrimination legislation. We now call it the Equality Act, that covers, as well as disability, gender and race and culture and age, and so on, and any kind of discrimination against something which